Thanks again, Brian, for presenting and going over the role of the FBI, as it relates to cybersecurity, and for discussing the threats and threat actors and the current environment for those malicious actors. So, how do we defend against these types of threats? And so, throughout the next topics and panels and discussions, we're going to highlight different areas of focus and go through, how we plan, prevent, and recover from attack. As Brian alluded to, we're going to go into more of the defense aspect and being able to plan and identify risk within an organization. So our panelists in the first panel section will focus on that and discuss the importance of visibility and the incorporation of an ongoing security practice, where it's not just a checklist, it's a continual security improvement and mitigating that risk to an organization. You'll hear from Greg Hatch, CEO of Saepio, and Coy Thorp, a solutions engineer of Arctic Wolf. So Greg has been in the security and systems and IT business for over 25 years, and he's held various roles at startups and with vendors such as Palo Alto, McAfee, and Cisco in security roles there, and is currently at Saepio. And Saepio, I'll let Greg, before you start your presentation, just give a little brief overview of the organization and Saepio, and then the same thing, he'll hand it off to Coy Thorp, as I mentioned, from Arctic Wolf. And Coy is a systems engineer who's had over 20 years of technical systems work with both at end clients, so performing that administration and security roles at clients, as well as working for Aruba and HPE for over 7 years, and now is in his current role at Arctic Wolf. And Coy, I think he's virtual, so you'll see him up on the screen as Greg hands off the presentation to him. So Coy, same thing, if you want to just give a brief overview of Arctic Wolf, and for the rest of our panelists as well, when you present, to do the same. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Greg, to start our panel.
There we go. The green light is on. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Vector USA. I get the opportunity to speak at these things about once a month or so, it seems like, pre-COVID, and now they're starting to ramp up again, so it's kind of exciting. But we do a lot of online webinars as well, and I absolutely love the format of this, to have the FBI here, to have law enforcement here, to help you guys understand. First of all, you're brilliant just for having those guys as a partner, because I think the approach towards cybersecurity is just such a fundamental essence of it. And the good news that I've got to report for everybody here today is you've only got 2 cybersecurity threats you even have to think about. You can wake up every day with the peace of mind thinking, I've only got 2 things I have to worry about. Everybody that works for you and everybody that doesn't. So simple equation, right? But what's interesting is when Jeff mentioned the cumulative time of the board and the panel up here, I didn't realize I was going to count for about half of that time. So it's funny. I've been in this a long time. I had the opportunity to start working with Amazon.com when there were 12 people in that company, and I absolutely love the way they approach cybersecurity. You don't read a lot about them in the news around cybersecurity because they do some things really right. And I've learned so much from those guys up in Seattle, where I live. You've got Boeing up there. You've got Microsoft. You've got just some brilliant people on how they approach it. And then having the opportunity to work for Cisco, to work for Intel, to work for Palo Alto Networks and others. It's just great to see the technologies that are out there. But why do the criminals keep succeeding at going after it? The first thing I will say is criminals are very lazy. I don't know if you want to attest to that or not, Brian, but they're not out there working really, really hard. They see the money in it, but they're going to go after the easy targets. And if you've got a hygiene that's mature, you're not going to be an easy target, and they don't like you. And that's the job that my company does. And what we see is an immediate impact of security hygiene versus the propensity of attack. And that's what gives me pride every day to wake up and go after and help our customers. We're going to talk about that just a little bit. So now I'm going to test my skills at running this device. So the first thing I will talk about is configuration matters. Benjamin Franklin, he came up with a saying a long time ago that says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But what I would love to understand from everybody in this room, if you're willing to raise your hand, how many of you wake up every day saying, hey, what am I doing to prevent an attack today? Every organization that I get the opportunity to work with tends to look at the reactive mode. Somebody's in our network. I just did a webinar about 2 months ago, and it was Sun Tzu would be sued. If you guys are familiar with the art of war, the last thing you want to see is your enemy in your camp. You don't want to see him in your network. You don't want to see him in your endpoint. Everything becomes way more expensive, way more challenging to defend once they're in there. So the first challenge I would say with any cybersecurity environment is, how do we not even become a target? What are those folks looking for? You've got to kind of put the black hat on once in a while and say, what are those guys looking for that's going to make me a target after somebody else? And if I'm out in the woods and I find out there's bears in the community, you guys have probably heard this before, you want to tighten up your tennis shoes. You can't outrun a bear, but you might be able to outrun that person that you're with. And that's the same prevention strategy, perhaps. But that's where we work with our customers is, hey, configurations matter. And the thing that Saepio does, that my company does, is we do reconnaissance better than any cyber criminal could ever do it. We want you to know what you've got, what you're exposing. What most people don't realize, especially in these modern digital infrastructures, when you've got public cloud, when you've got maybe a little bit of shadow IT, when you've got people that you don't know within your environment, when you don't have the trust principles built in, you're leaking a massive amount of information into the internet. The internet is made to share information, and it shares a lot of metadata. It shares a lot of things about you that you might not want shared. And those are the things that criminals look for. They're out there looking and saying, hey, what are these guys doing? Are they demonstrating to me that I'm exposing vulnerable systems, that I'm leaking API keys, that I'm leaking credentials that would be a target for me? So the first thing that you need to understand is, what do you have out there and what's it look like? And do you know about that? We had one large financial institution that we work with, and they had a new chief information security officer that came, and they hired us to help her understand what they had in their environment. And she said, I found more from you guys in 2 hours than my IT teams could tell me about our environment in 6 months. I mean, that's the challenge, is these infrastructures that you all are touching with your companies, they're growing, moving so fast that most people don't even understand what they look like on the internet to the adversaries. But the adversaries are out there doing a really good job of reconnaissance. We're going to touch on that a little bit. Architecture matters. How are you guys designing these architectures? We talked a little bit about permissions earlier in Brian's conversation. We find leaky API keys all the time. We find these things out there in the environment because now you've got to have third-party risk. You've got to understand, hey, if I'm sharing data with my partners, what happens? One of the companies up in Seattle is T-Mobile, and their CEO had to come on, announce to the world that says, hey, we compromised, I think it was a couple million subscribers' data. They had to go public with it, hurt their company. And the issue wasn't their infrastructure at all. It was a third party that they share that information with that did credit risk for them to understand whether their subscriber was there. So what happens with that third party? How are those guys securing their environment? And do you know what they've got? And so we work with our clients to make sure they've got the contracts in place so they can help advise the third party providers to say, hey, you've got my customer information. I want to make sure your hygiene is as clean as mine is. Because it doesn't matter where that customer gets compromised. If it's your customer, you own that responsibility. And the last part is just the overall day-to-day hygiene of what takes place there. So one of the slides I like, whoops, I think it's going to move forward there. One of the slides that I really liked that Brian had up there was the one on reconnaissance as the first step. And Lockheed Martin came up with the idea of a cyber kill chain. You guys might have heard of that, familiar with it. But the first step is always reconnaissance. So what I've got on the screen right now is 2 pictures of 2 different companies, and we've made them anonymous. Interestingly enough, the one that we're calling Acme Corp, that is a Fortune 100 company. These guys are massive. They've got over 100,000 employees across the globe. And if you take a look at those red starbursts, this is what an organization looks like on the internet. You look at the density in the middle, that's their data center. You look at some cloud environments there. But the first thing that we do with a company is we really take a snapshot of an organization, say, this is what you look like on the internet. Most organizations don't know what they look like on the internet. So we want to give a visualization of that, and then we get into a lot more of the metadata and the details around it. But Acme Corp, looks like a sparrow flying through the night. That's what we want every one of our customers to look like, is to say, hey, you know what? There's nothing to see here. Let's move on. Let's chase after that person that doesn't have their tennis shoes on quite as tight. And I can eat that person today. I'll save Acme Corp for a day when I may be a little bit more ambitious or something. The company on right has been breached several times. Those red bursts, those are things that a hacker looks for, a black hat looks for, and he says, I think I can get into this pretty easily. And guess what they do? They get in there, they penetrate it, they get out. What's interesting is the customers always ask me, hey, how do you know when you've been attacked? Brian comes knocking on your door. More of the exposures that we find from our customers is that the FBI comes knocking and says, hey, we're finding a whole bunch of information about you guys on the dark web. Somewhere you've got to compromise. Then you've got to start responding to that. You say, okay, how did we leak it? Where did they get in? How long have they been in there? Those are the very, very expensive breaches that cost companies tons of money just to remediate. And I think at 6.5 months is the average now for somebody to get into your infrastructure and be stealing data before you even know that they're in there. And it just is an area where you say, hey, what if we were able to close those gaps up before anybody could ever get in there? And then I can apply the resources, the limited resources that I have, towards the things that really matter within my environment. So the kill chain that we talked about earlier, our whole focus as a company, and you're going to hear people talk about later on in the kill chain, but our whole focus in our company is to stop an attack at the reconnaissance level, to do reconnaissance better than anybody else can, to show an organization where an attacker is most likely going to go after them, how they're going to do it, how they're going to pivot, why you're exposed there. And then the other thing that I think is just really, really important in cybercrime right now is institutional awareness, meaning that I work with companies all the time where they've worked for same organization for 15, 20 years. They know exactly what their company has, but they don't know what's happening with 400 other companies around the globe and the techniques that the cyber criminals are using. They know what they know. They don't know what everybody else knows. But what we want to do is we want to bring that institutional understanding as well and say, hey, this is an attack vector that matters right now. And I do like the word vector, by the way, Jeff. This is an attack vector that matters right now. And you guys are exposing it. So those would be the ones that we prioritize. We help our customers prioritize, because guess what? Just like that company that had all of the big starbursts, you're not going to fix that overnight. You're just not. You know, it took some companies 20, 25 years to get to the point where they're at within their digital infrastructure. So you got to start whittling it away and saying, where should we prioritize what resources we have to get things fixed? But what we want to do, the first thing we want to do is make it really, 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 really hard to do any type of meaningful reconnaissance on your organization and have anything that they're going to look at and say, hey, I think I've got something here that I can go after. I remember when I worked with Palo Alto Networks, we used to put new environments into public cloud. And I remember one of our top guys, he ended up creating an environment in AWS, and he walked away to get a cup of coffee. And before he could go to his password manager, he just put in password as a password. And by the time he got back, that entire site had been compromised. We're talking 1.5 minutes. AWS gets scanned now, I think about every 7 seconds. Every IP on their entire environment is being scanned to look for opportunities of people that didn't do the proper thing within their cloud environment. My guess is every IP within your organization gets scanned a few times a day. And who collects that data? There are companies that will sell that data, just, you know, as Brian was talking about, they'll sell it to anybody that wants to buy it, and then they'll use that as the reconnaissance against you. And what we do as a company is we collect data from about 2 different sources, including law enforcement, and we take all of that data and we show you guys what your reconnaissance what your digital environment looks like and where the opportunities might exist there. So last thing I'm going to touch on here a little bit is, you know, why do people get compromised? That's one of the questions that we always ask when somebody has an incident is there, hey, how come it happened to me? What happened? And we had one medical institution, they came and says, man, why did we get hit? And I like to say my business partner, he's like a savant. I mean, the guy's been in cyber for his entire life and just a brilliant, brilliant guy. I met him at Palo Alto Networks. And he looks in these environments and says, I'm surprised you haven't been attacked a lot more. And I think that's the way you've got to approach this, just as Brian mentioned. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to get attacked. You want to make it harder for those guys. You want to make it less profitable for those guys. And I believe so strongly in a lot of the principles that are out there. Zero trust. You guys are hearing zero trust from probably everybody in the industry anymore. I think it's really becoming popular. I think it's important. You're talking about less permissive systems that can help you, give the right privilege to the right people at the right time. And that technology is really maturing, and it's so important. And zero trust. But how do you implement a zero trust? When you've got a digital infrastructure that's 20, 25 years old, how do you implement zero trust? Where do you start? What happens with that environment? And so what we want to help you guys do is map out your environment, identify where those points that it could be implemented would be. One of the other big areas we're doing right now, and I think this is going to be something that's going to be talked about for the next decade or so, is Active Directory. Everybody is looking at Active Directory, and we see so much permissive activity happening because a new employee comes on. Oh, we'll put them in Active Directory, and they've got the keys to the kingdom. They can elevate their permissions throughout. The smart ones they'll figure out how to elevate their permissions, and pretty soon they've got access to financial statements. They've got access to things that they should not have access to as a brand new employee. And so we map out Active Directory. We map out your internal infrastructure. We map out your attack surface infrastructure, and we just help you guys have the reconnaissance that you need on how to apply the tools that you're going to hear more about here later to the right place at the right time with the right amount of investment. And so I am going to, I think, turn it over to Coy right now. He and his company, Arctic Wolf, these guys are phenomenal. So unless we've got time for a few questions, it's entirely up to you.
Thanks a lot, Greg. I really appreciate it. So I think we're going to have questions at the end, which is great. I want to thank Vector. Echo Greg's sentiment. I've worked with Vector for many years in my career at Aruba, and now in my career at Arctic Wolf. Excellent organization, team at Vector. I really appreciate this time and opportunity to talk to everyone in this presentation. Now, one of the things about the title of our section here that I share with Greg is the titles have a plan. So one of the things about having a plan is that if you look at cybersecurity, I think that there's been plans or frameworks that have existed for us for a long time. And those frameworks have either come about based on active compromise. So when you look at things like HIPAA or PCI compliance, those particular frameworks that exist inside those compliance efforts are in direct response to attacks that happen for those specific industries, right? We wouldn't have PCI compliance if we didn't have millions of credit card information get exploited on a regular basis. So that's part of that. But if you look overall, right, if I'm building security operations, because that's really what the focus of this is. If I'm making a plan, part of my plan needs to be to operationalize security. Now, if I'm going to operationalize security, I have to really make that part of my IT DNA. So to make that part of my IT DNA, I need to start with a framework. And NIST has really come up with a great framework, right? You identify, protect, respond, recover, the things about that NIST framework that give us the information that we need in order for us to build that security operations. The challenge that we faced is that we've treated that NIST framework as a checklist. And it really isn't a checklist, right? It really is very much a cycle. So the question I pose when I think about how do I build and make a plan in my cybersecurity infrastructure is, first, how do I start the cycle? How do I stop treating cybersecurity activities as checklists in order to move on to the next thing on the plate? Well, like I said earlier, I think part of it is that you have to build this into your IT DNA. It needs to be culturalized inside of your environment. So you start with broad visibility. So Saepio does an excellent job of giving you that reconnaissance that you need. That helps you to get that broad visibility. I need to not just be worried about one piece of my infrastructure. You know, there are people out there to tell you, look at your endpoints. Your endpoints are the source of your threat. And I would say, yes, endpoints are a source of threat, but endpoints aren't the only source of threat. I need visibility across my entire infrastructure. I need to be able to not just see endpoints, but also look at network infrastructure and also look at whatever I'm having hosting in the cloud as well. So that's broad visibility is one of the ways that we can start that cycle of of, of bringing cybersecurity posture into my organization. The second thing we really need to do is focus on security outcomes. We as organizations need to look at, and we as IT individuals, like, look at, what do I want to accomplish? There are tactical things that are part of uh, IT operations that we need to absolutely take care of, but we also need to have an overall strategy, and that really drives us towards those outcomes. So a security outcome would be, okay, I've detected a threat or something bad has happened, or I see that I am unpatched. What's the outcome that I'm looking to do? That security outcome for an organization isn't necessarily that I've reached all the Microsoft patch levels. The security outcome would be that I can prove to the business that we have mitigated this risk, and that the spend that they have to mitigate that risk is actually providing value to the organization. So it's really about the outcome. It's not just about the incident handling. If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to truly operationalize security, it also needs to be 24/7 by 365. And when I say that, people like, well, I've got tools that help me monitor and look at things, and I'll get alerts. Well, that's great. You're going to get alerts, but you're also going to be asleep at 3 a.m., I hope. And you may not receive that alert in a timely fashion. So in order to truly operationalize that security, it needs to be a 24/7, 365. And then finally, you have to have an overall strategy that drives your tactical response to threats. This is where, so when you do this, right, this truly operationalizes your security and will help you uh, to not just make this part of your IT DNA or culture, but it also help you make it part of your organizational culture. Too often we do security posture reviews in response to either audits or breaches. And those things, I mean, I think that's critical to do those around those events, but security posture reviews need to be part of your regular ongoing cadence inside of IT. How often do you do that? How often are you looking at those things that you need to look at in order to understand and determine where your weaknesses are and how to mitigate those weaknesses? So that's part of the strategy. So, you know, I was asked earlier to kind of explain what Arctic Wolf does. I kind of left that to the end of this, but really that's really what we help our customers do, right? We help our customers take the security checklist that they kind of have in their head or that they've built and truly operationalize it, and not just do that through monitoring and that tactical response that's required 24/7, 365, but we provide resources to help customers drive that overall strategy, so that over time they continue to elevate and increase their cybersecurity posture and the organizational security maturity, because that's really what we're looking to do. This isn't a checklist. This isn't something that I can just, okay, I've scanned my network and I know everything that's on it, so done. I'm done with identity. I've identified everything. That's not how this works. This has to be an ongoing iterative process that's part of an operational approach to security. It's not just I'm doing this one thing and I can move on to the next thing as I get time and have budget and have attention. So my side of the presentation was pretty short. I appreciate the time here. I wanted to turn it over and make sure we have time to answer questions, and and provide information to those that are attending. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Coy. Am I good for or can you hear me from this or no? Yeah, good, great, thank you. So before we turn it over to questions, I kind of wanted to run through an applicable scenario where I think a lot of organizations are either struggling with or just coming to terms with. And as we all know, over the past couple of years, pre-COVID and now during COVID, many organizations were shifting a lot of their on-premise or data center infrastructure out to cloud or hosted services. So I think, Greg talked about earlier that this creates new challenges and new ways to look at what the infrastructure of an organization is, what the architecture of an organization is. And then during COVID, we had this disbursement, this distribution of our endpoints, of our users. So from a security perspective, Greg, if you wanted to kind of talk about what the challenges are, and here I can give you the mic, for visibility now that we've taken this on-premise, mostly static environment into where we are today.
Yeah, I think it used to be so easy to have a data center, and you guys have all heard about it, build a big brick wall moat around the data center, put some alligators in there, make sure nobody can get into the data center because that's where all of the crown jewels are. But if you take a look at an organization anymore, I've got enough information on this device that this has to be protected. My data center is no longer it's still important, but you've got these cloud environments, you've got these third parties, you've got all of these SaaS providers. We map out somewhere around 3,000 unique SaaS providers for our customers, and they've got data in all of those. And so how do you identify where all of this goes? And the interesting thing is I've got one organization we work with, he calls it the 4 C's. And this is when an executive goes to IT and says, hey, when can I get this environment set up for me? Because I've got to meet this goal. IT says, well, we've got about a 9-month cycle, and then goes to security and they say, well, IT's got a 9-month cycle, and then we're going to have to secure it. That's going to take another 6 months. He goes, nope, I got to deliver on this quarter. So he whips out his credit card, slides a credit card, gets a consultant that'll build an environment in the cloud environment somewhere, and then all of a sudden moves all of that data in there. And so IT doesn't always know about it. Security doesn't know about it. There's none of the framework that they've built for security around it. So how do you find that stuff? How do you protect that stuff? And that's the challenge we all live through every single day. Is it used to be so easy when you could control all of IT, but now anybody with a credit card has access to IT infrastructure that used to be, coveted, and they need to move fast because they need that digital advantage, and that's the challenge that we all have to deal with every single day.
Yeah, I think that you make a good point, Greg. That we've focused in IT on controls. And we've focused a lot of our IT spend and budget and frankly our work around wrapping controls around the infrastructure. And when the workforce dispersed, those controls, that hard crunchy shell that we created around the company just became irrelevant, really, because the devices dispersed out into the world, and we're coming across various sorts of internet connections that we had absolutely no controls over. So it really does start with visibility. When as soon as we disperse that workforce, we had to become much more aware of what those devices were doing on a minute by minute, day by day basis.
Yeah, agreed. And then, so Coy, from an operational perspective, how in that iterative process that you were talking about, that improvement process, what have you been seeing when as these changes are occurring, those unique circumstances now incorporated into that posture? So the business unit may be going out and saying, I'd like to bring in this service, or this is the reality that we're faced with. So how to kind of build that into the culture? What have you seen? That's a good way to kind of start that journey.
Well, part of that is continuous monitoring, right? So when those things get spun up, right? They don't happen completely in a vacuum, right? There are company assets that are being used to create those new resources, and having visibility into that asset that is creating that new resource is critical. So in order to have that visibility, it requires, um, you know, being able to look at TCP flow data. I mean, I know I'm really getting into the weeds here, but that's really what it comes down to. I cannot, you know, those of us in the audience that are network engineers, one of the things that we have said for years and years is that packets don't lie. And if we can see what is happening on the, not just our infrastructure, but also visibility into the cloud instances that we have visibility into, so that when an organization, so they may have multiple AWS instances, for example, and they may have multiple people that they have given rights to spin up new instances. But we need to have the visibility into when that happens, so that when it does happen, we can ensure that that new instance has been created with the correct posture and the correct controls. When that endpoint device goes out and subscribes to some new service, we need to have that visibility into seeing that endpoint device subscribe to that new service. So it really does come down to visibility. If I don't have visibility, there's no amount of controls I can execute on to make the organization secure. And I need to operationalize around visibility first.
I would just like to touch a little bit on, in my time in security for so many years, it was always an event, right? I mean, we've all got, man, we just deployed an entire new infrastructure of endpoint firewalls, whatever it is, and you spend a lot of time thinking about what controls you have on it. And I came from the financial world. That's what I studied. And just like in financial controls, you get quarterly reviews, you get financial statements quarterly for a reason. And the quarter financial review against last quarter financial review tells you all kinds of things. And I would just suggest that security has to play that same role. It has to be continuous. We can't look at security anymore. Well, I just made a big investment in new technology, so let's focus on it and then go on. It's got to be something you've got to look at every day, week, month, quarter. And we coined a phrase called CSI, sorry, not crime scene investigation, but continuous security improvement. You know, we want to be able to demonstrate to our subscribers every week, month, quarter that you're making improvement in your security posture. And just like Coy was saying, you know, it's watching those things, because it can literally shift overnight, and it happens so darn fast. And so I would just challenge everybody, if you're looking at security in any way as an event, think about it more in a continuous motion. If you can put those, you know, controls into place where you're constantly looking at it, it's gonna, I think, give you a lot more security and peace at night.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that we've bought a bunch of tools, right? If you look at your IT budget and the things that you've spent money on, we have a lot of security tools in place. We have endpoint platforms, we have firewalls, we have things to look at that information. But the problem is nobody's looking at it. And we have to have someone looking at it. We have to have that. Otherwise, the value, the spend that we spent on that IT infrastructure, or whatever it is, isn't providing the value to the organization that it should be.
Agreed. So if we want to open up the panel to questions from the live audience, and then as well as virtual. So if you want to send in any questions kind of regarding the topics of this discussion to either Greg or Coy, then send those in, but I'll open it up to the floor. All right, so Greg, you brought up, not just looking at the endpoints, but the network and the cloud services and the infrastructure. Where would you say the most risk lies, in solving, kind of that, we only have a limited budget. We're trying to defend against the most types of attacks. When you visualize an environment, what specifically are you looking for that could cause the most damage for an organization?
Yeah, the unknowns. I mean, organizations that have the really nasty attacks, they're oftentimes of areas that they didn't even know existed within their infrastructure. And I think that's the big challenge. And, that's the one that is no longer, as I like Brian, from a legal perspective, plausible deniability is no longer an acceptable answer when somebody gets compromised. And then the other thing that our customers care most deeply about right now, it seems like, and this is really something that's happened over the last 6 to 9 months, is third-party risk. I mean, my data is now going to places that I don't have any policy or controls over. How do I see that?
And then Coy, you started to bring up frameworks and the NIST framework, and I like that you said that it's a good place to start with the NIST framework. So if an organization hasn't adopted a specific framework for either compliance purposes, where would you suggest they begin to look at within the NIST framework? And it's and if you can go into a little bit more detail of your thoughts on that one.
Well, I think if you haven't adopted a framework, I think the first thing you need to do when you look at that, and I believe NIST is a good one. I like it because it's standards based, and I also like it because it's not tied to any one specific compliance effort, right? If you adopt the NIST framework, it will help you meet other compliance efforts inside the organization, whether that's FISMA or PCI or HIPAA or whatever those efforts are. So for me, it can be very daunting to step into a realm where you haven't really dipped your toes in. So you want to look for some quick wins. You look at the NIST framework and say, okay, what am I doing for identity management? What am I doing for protection? What are the controls that are in place that I have already existing on my infrastructure that help me to better show that I'm adopting this framework? And when you look for those quick wins, I think it helps you as an organization to gain some, I guess, confidence around the ability to continue to grow into that framework in a way that's not just intelligent, but makes sense for the organization and helps you identify where you need to go next for that framework adoption.
It's really important to know what you're adding to your infrastructure, where it's going, and things of that nature, because knowledge is key. And then you also mentioned that, businesses need to move at a certain speed, and then IT and security need to move at a different speed. So how do you rate, or what do you tell your customers is the threat scale when they want to do something? And because businesses need to keep going, and IT and security need to keep something secure. So where is that balance, and how do you assess that balance, and how do you communicate that back out?
That's the excellent question. And how many of you have unlimited budget to spend as much as you need on security? No hands up there. That's always the challenge. It's interesting, in other areas of IT, you do get that budget because it's something that drives productivity. And this is risk. And the challenge that happens is our two biggest sources for customers are pen testers, interestingly enough, because they're constantly under pressure. I've got one pen tester that has never failed. They've been around for 30, 35 years. And if they're going to pen test something, they're going to get in there and they're going to breach you. White hat. And so when executives are spending money against that, they can look at that and say, hey, you know what? But pen testing does not make your security better. It makes that one pinpoint area. They will identify areas that you can improve on. But how do you holistically do that? And what I would argue is budget is the toughest thing for cybersecurity, and come up with some way to measure your progress day, week, month, quarter. And we've got one of the parts of our platform is the improvement quarter over quarter, as I mentioned earlier in a financial. But you've really got to look at cyber, I think, not as a technology, but as a business process. And along with that, understand the financial controls around that. And that's really hard to do. And it doesn't get talked about very much, but I think it's an important part.
Yeah, and I think to that, right, when you adopt cybersecurity as part of your IT culture, you need to bring business stakeholders along with you. So when you're doing those cybersecurity posture reviews, you need to have stakeholders that are outside of IT as part of that posture review process. So they understand what the impact is, not only to the business when they make a decision, but how they can leverage what you're doing and help you to understand where the business is going, so that when you're doing those posture reviews, you are taking the business needs into account. If you're not including, people in finance and people in people management as part of your process for cybersecurity, you're leaving out big chunks of the organization that you need to have as part of that review.
Agreed. I think that was a great discussion and a good introduction into planning and getting organizations thinking about how they're going to visualize, as you both were saying, the risk and the vulnerability within their organizations.